Hi Dan, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for a chat. We're going to be covering a couple of different issues today, but I'm very excited to be promoting your brilliant book, One Man's Terror, That
Thanks.
of the IRA. It's an excellent cover as well. Did you have any say on the cover?
Um, well, I saw it when they came up with it, and I was pleased with it. So yeah, I didn't have to didn't have to raise any protests. Yeah.
So tell us a bit about the book and what was the inspiration behind it and where it's kind of taken you.
Well, it's a political history of the IRA and the Republican movements, as the subtitle says, and that's quite different in focus from a number of the books that have been written about the provos in particular. Um, Focus quite heavily on the military side of the movement and the inner life of the IRA, and giving a kind of detailed chronological account of the IRA campaign, which I wasn't really trying to do or trying to repeat. I was looking much more at the history of the movement's political interventions and also the political ideas that it had at the top. Um, and not just looking specifically at, when you talk about Sinn Féin and the IRA and the Republican movements in that period in the 70s, 80s, 90s, it's generally identified with the provisionals, and that's natural enough because they did become by far the most important, the most influential faction. But particularly in the early stages, in the period from the late 1960s up to the mid and to some extent into the late 70s, you did have various rival groups that were contesting that space. You had the official Republicans, the official IRA and Sinn Féin, who were on the scene up to the mid 1970s. You had an attempt to set up a rival group by Seamus Costello, the IRSP, Irish Republican Socialist Party, and its military wing, the INLA. You had smaller left wing groups like People's Democracy that were influential in their own way, not so much to being able to change the course of events by themselves, but by having an influence on larger groups and introducing ideas into the mix. And he also had individuals like Bernadette McCalskey, who doesn't really fit into any of those kind of neat organizational boxes, but was clearly a very important figure in her own right, and there were other people like that. It was an opportunity, I think, at this stage as well to look back on it and write about it as history rather than as current affairs. There'd been a particular cluster of books about the history of the IRA and Sinn Féin that came out in the late 90s and the early 2000s, and most of them were written by reporters who'd been covering the Troubles beat for most of their careers, people like Peter Taylor and Brendan O'Brien and Ed Maloney. Some really good books, really important and useful books. But it was an opportunity now to come at it as an historian, because for the first time had access to a lot of the archival materials that weren't available in the past, such as the government papers from the Northern Ireland office and from the Irish government as well. We don't have the full spectrum of them now, but we have a good sample of them up as far as the early 90s. There have been memoirs written by people who were involved, although not to the same extent as there was from the War of Independence, because obviously that tells you something important about the nature of the conflict and the way it was resolved, that people still do have this threat of being prosecuted hanging over them. And of course, that was really dramatized by the controversy over Boston College and the oral history project there, and the attempted trial of Gerry Adams and the actual trial of Ivor Bell. So as a result, you don't have so much as, from the War of Independence. Within a few years or a couple of decades, you had memoirs by people like Tom Barry and Dan Breen and Ernie O'Malley, and then you had all the witness statements that were collected by the Bureau of Military History. It's not clear at this stage whether we are going to get that kind of material, because there hasn't been any, across the board amnesty for people who are involved. So anyone who decides to put down their side of the story, whether by giving an interview or by writing a book of their own, they still have to be allowed to the legal issues. But in a way, for the focus that I was taking with the book, that wasn't such an issue as it might be for a different kind of history of republicanism. Let's say, for example, if someone is trying to write a very kind of detailed micro study of the IRA in Derry or the IRA in Tyrone or the IRA in South Armagh, you would need that kind of oral history. Whereas when you're looking at the kind of bird's eye, top down political history of the movements, um, you don't have to burrow away in hidden corners so much. You just need to read the public statements of the movement, the editorials in Unpublic and the interviews and the speeches and so on, which do give you a good sense of what was going on with the movement. And then for the secret history of the IRA as a complement to that, in a way, I think the best record that we have of that we're likely to have is already there from the contemporary reporting from the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, rather than, even if you do get the opportunity to speak to people at this stage 20, 30, 40 years on, there's always the danger that hindsight is going to affect the way that people remember things that happened. Hindsight has that effect on people even when it's a fairly uncontroversial subject and not something that's obviously very fraught, like the history and the divisions in the Republican movement. Whereas going back to the journalism that was printed at the time, at least it may have been flawed in one way or another, but it doesn't have that issue of hindsight warping people's perspective. Yeah, I mean, that term civil resistance, it's one that it's unfortunately been hijacked by Gene Sharp and people following on from him, where it's been associated with this idea of Gandhian non-violence. And I find that distinction between violence and non-violence in reference to political protests to be really unhelpful and quite asinine in a way, because you get this situation where if people are on a demonstration or if they're on a picket line, and they're attacked by the police or they're attacked by some goons sent in by the regime, if they just sit back and take it, then it's a non-violent protest. But if they defend themselves, then it's suddenly violent. I don't think that's useful at all, and especially because the way that people in the media tend to talk about violence versus non-violence, even the tactics that were used by Martin Luther King would unquestionably be described as violence if they were used by a social movement today, because they were disruptive and deliberately disruptive, and often involved defying the law. Non-violence in that sense that King would have understood it didn't mean marching peacefully from point A to point E without causing any inconvenience to upholders of the status quo. So I think that distinction between armed struggle and civil resistance is more useful, because civil resistance, it may not be strictly peaceful or pacifist in the Gandhian sense, but it's definitely not the same as people forming themselves into, a guerrilla army like the IRA or like the ANC or like the Viet Cong, which has its own weapons, usually light weapons in that sense of rifles, pistols, homemade explosives, and going out and attacking the forces of the state. Whereas, all the forms of civil resistance that we saw in the late 60s and the early 70s, they involved protests that became a form of civil resistance because they were illegal, whether they were partially illegal. The Derry civil rights demonstration in October 68, where it became illegal. The march itself wasn't illegal, but the route that they chose through the city centre of Derry was prohibited by the RUC. And then you have subsequent marches like the march on the day of Bloody Sunday, which was illegal full stop, because the Faulkner government had banned demonstrations. You had the no-go areas that were established in Derry and West Belfast, where the forces of the state actually couldn't operate. And also you had the rent and rates campaign of non-payments, which was a really kind of challenging form of resistance to the state. That was very strong in areas like Derry and West Belfast and Strabane. So altogether, it added up to quite an impressive and quite formidable campaign of opposition to the state at that time, which wasn't, it certainly hasn't been fully appreciated in hindsight, because I think the point that has been lost sight of most is that moment of 1971, 1972, because everyone remembers the civil rights protests, and there's a tendency to assume that the civil rights movement ran for approximately a year between the Derry March in October 68 and the eruption of violence with the Battle of the Bogside and the disturbances in Belfast in August 69. And from that point on, it was a confrontation between the IRA and the British Army. And that completely glosses over what was happening. There was a period of about a year and a half where people essentially vacated the streets, apart from teenagers going out to have a kind of scrappy battle with British soldiers. But there was a clear attempt in the second half of 1971 and the very beginning of 1972 by people, particularly people on the left. And that was quite a fluid category because it spanned people who were involved in the Republican organizations and people who were involved in left parties and freelance activists and different organizations. You know, there were two umbrella groups, the Civil Rights Association and the Northern Resistance Movement. But they were all there trying to give some kind of shape and direction to this largely spontaneous movement of civil resistance that sprung up in response to internment in August 1971. You know, I think Eamon McCann captured it quite well and quite honestly when he said that in Derry, a group of left and Republican activists came forward and called for the rent and rate strike. And it wasn't because they had any kind of tremendous influence in the Bogside or in Creggan. It was because they were the first people who happened to be in the field with a call that gave people a lead for something they could do. And as he said, if it had been the Plymouth Brethren who came forward with the same call, they would have been the ones taking the initiative. But it was giving people a kind of direction. And, you know, it reached a peak with the Derry March in January 1972, which of course is remembered because of the Derry massacre by the paratroopers. And it's quite an important point in hindsight, because part of the self-image of the provisionals and their narrative of the conflict and how they explain their actions was to say that Bloody Sunday was a turning point, after which armed struggle was the only option, and there was no more room for any other form of political action. And there's no question that, you know, for the hundreds and hundreds of young men and young women who joined the IRA after Bloody Sunday, that was the way they saw things, and it was understandable that they might have seen things in that light. But actually there was a brief moment, a period of about 2 or 3 months after Bloody Sunday, when civil resistance actually reached a peak, because there was a follow-on march in Newry not long afterwards, which was the biggest one of all. It was attended by about 50,000 people. And if you read the press in the days leading up to it, there was all kinds of alarmist scaremongering that there might be a repeat of the killings in Derry if they went ahead with this march, and people from the British government and other people in positions of authority urging people to stay at home. But in fact, when it happened, there was a huge demonstration there, and there was really no question of repeating what was done on Bloody Sunday, because it would have been a catastrophe for the British government. There was a British Army helicopter hovering over the crowd and threatening by loudspeaker to arrest people, but nothing was done. The rent and rate strike was strengthened in the aftermath. There was beginnings of a support movement in the south for the first time, where there had been a lot of fairly diffuse emotional sympathy for Northern nationalists in the south from '69 onwards, but this started to take on organised shape. You had solidarity protest committees. You had a general strike, baptised it as a day of national mourning, because that would have seemed less provocative or less confrontational in a way. Of course, you had the famous disturbances at the British Embassy in Dublin, where the embassy was burnt to the ground. And Jack Lynch, felt obliged to respond to that sentiment and that kind of pressure in the south. He spoke in the Dáil, and he promised to fund what he called non-violent civil disobedience in opposition to the Stormont government in the north. And of course, the SDLP already had a position of refusing to engage with the British government or with the Parliament in Stormont. And that was, reaffirmed in the aftermath. So you had a brief moment then of near unanimous refusal of cooperation and engagement with the state by the nationalist population, backed up by a lot of sympathy in the south, which proved to be quite ephemeral, because the British government realised this was a moment that it couldn't really deal with, certainly not by a kind of head-on confrontation. And so instead they opted for a more nuanced approach. They suspended Stormont, they imposed direct rule, and they put out feelers for a reform initiative. And the Provos, because of their political limitations, especially at that time, they didn't really appreciate the significance of this moment, and they thought they had won, or at least some of their more, politically unsophisticated leaders, people like Sean McStephon, thought they had won. There's the famous account from the moment of truce between the Provos and the British government, where McStephon sat down to negotiate with William Whitelaw, and essentially presented them with a timetable for surrender, a timetable for withdrawal, to be out by the end of 1974. And the civil servants on the British side said it was extraordinary. It was like he thought he was General Montgomery dealing with the German generals in 1945 and telling them exactly what they had to do if they wanted peace. And even from Gerry Adams, from his side, in his memoir, he says more or less the same thing, that they broke off to have a private discussion. McStephon turned to the rest of the delegation and said, "Jesus, we have it. We have it." He thought it was like 1921 again, except this time there wasn't going to be a treaty, there wasn't going to be a compromise. They were just going to get what they wanted and be done with British rule on the island once for all. But that really misunderstood what the British government was in a position or was willing to do at that point. And because of the nature of that movement, they didn't have a political wing at that point. I mean, Sinn Féin, it did exist, but it was essentially a paper organization with policies, but no real political weight. So they were in an awkward position where if they didn't go back to war, then the initiative would drain away from them to other forces. It might drain away to the SDLP or to the Civil Rights Association or to others. But if they did go back to war, they would find themselves politically isolated, which is what happened. They went back onto their campaign in the summer of 72. They never really tried to explain to the nationalist population why they thought it was necessary to go back to war, in spite of the fact that you had direct rule now, and there was talk of reform initiatives. And so they very quickly found themselves isolated, particularly because of Bloody Friday, which happened not long afterwards, and that was, obviously a propaganda disaster for the Provisionals. It was deeply unpopular with the people who might have been sympathetic to them a few months earlier. But I think even if there hadn't been something like that to happen, they would have found themselves quite isolated. And in a way, Kevin Bean put this quite well in his book about the evolution of the Republican movement, where he said that in a way you could tell the whole subsequent history of the Provisionals as an attempt to recapture that moment of initiative and momentum that they had in the first few months of 1972, which they never quite managed to do.
So Dan, next year is going to be the 40th anniversary of the H Block protests. It would be interesting to hear your thoughts on the different political positions at the time and even how it's remembered today, if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, it's interesting to talk about in the light of what I was saying earlier about the importance of civil resistance, because this was another example of that. There were three episodes in the whole history of the Troubles when civil resistance was concentrated. The first was 68, 69. The second was 71, 72. And then the third was 1980, 81. And it's not a coincidence, because you do find the same people involved in all three. You see people like Bernadette McCalskey and Michael Farrell and other people from a left-wing background come to the fore, because they were people who had a kind of orientation towards that whole approach to politics based on mass protest, civil disobedience, and so on. Whereas the politics, the Republican movement, was much more militarist, or at least it had been up to that point. For most of the 1970s, Sinn Féin didn't really have any weight of its own, and the IRA was the only game in town as far as the Provisionals were concerned. And they had reached this point in the late 1970s where they were extremely isolated, and the new leadership that came to power in the movement, grouped around Gerry Adams, they realised that they had to build some kind of political movement alongside the military organisation and break out of this isolation. And there's sometimes a tendency to draw a straight line between the ideas that were first expressed by people like Adams and Danny Morrison, and the breakthrough Sinn Féin as a political party in the 1980s, a few years later. But that really oversimplifies things, because the ideas they put forward at first in 77, 78 never came to fruition. I mean, they had this idea that they're going to build up a movement in the south that was based on militant class struggle, working class support, that would be in parallel and in support of the IRA campaign in the north. And that was never done by Sinn Féin. You know, the time when Sinn Féin actually made a big political breakthrough in the south came long after the IRA campaign had ended. And to the extent that there was an opening for the left in the south at all, it was actually, you know, being exploited by the Workers' Party, who of course came out of the officials who were bitterly hostile to the provos and vice versa. The moment that actually led to this political breakthrough for Sinn Féin was something that they hadn't planned or anticipated, and had actually been at first quite hostile to, which was a movement in solidarity with the prisoners, who had been denied special category status in Long Kesh and in the other prisons. And the initial idea to have a broad campaign in support of those prisoners came from fairly small left-wing groups like People's Democracy and activists like Bernadette McCalskey. And initially there was quite a brusque rejection of it by the provos. They were insistent that, you know, it wasn't enough to have a movement that supported the demands of the prisoners. It had to be a movement that supported the IRA campaign as well. They didn't believe in this idea of united front campaigns that would have been in the jargon of the far left. And they poured scorn on groups like People's Democracy and individuals like McCalskey. And they stuck to this line more or less up as far as the European election, the first direct European election in the north in 1979, when McCalskey ran on a platform supporting the prisoners. And not only did the provos oppose her campaign, but they actually campaigned against her. You know, when she was canvassing in the Bogside, Martin McGuinness famously followed her around with a megaphone telling people not to vote for her. You know, that was the kind of height of sort of ourselves alone sectarianism on the part of Sinn Féin. But they belatedly realised that if they were going to have any kind of political initiative in support of the prisoners, they were going to have to drop this attitude and open it out to people who wouldn't necessarily support the IRA or the IRA campaign, but might support them as prisoners. And that was really the crucial breakthrough that led to those protests that happened in 1980 and even more so in 1981. Stuart Ross has written a very good book looking at the history of that campaign as a social movement, which again is kind of neglected, where a lot of the work in it focuses on what was happening inside the prisons and you know, the high level negotiations behind the scenes between the British government and the IRA and various other protagonists, but it neglects what was happening on the streets, because that was certainly what enabled Sinn Féin to make their big breakthrough from 82 onwards. You know, if you imagine just a few years earlier, in the late 70s, if Sinn Féin had started running candidates at a point when the IRA was extremely isolated and unpopular, they probably would have done quite badly, and it would have been more of a you know, a factor for demoralization. But you know, coming out of the movements, Tommy McCartney made an argument, I thought, in his book about the provisionals, because of course he was one of the prisoners in the Maeves at the time, and he was involved in the first hunger strike. But he said that he believed the Republican leadership at that time, because of their kind of organizational culture and their whole MO of doing politics, they were quite suspicious of a movement like the one in solidarity with the HBOC prisoners, because it was too broad and it was too unpredictable and it was chaotic, spontaneous. It involved different currents. It couldn't be directed from the top down. Whereas their whole organizational culture built up around the IRA was very hierarchical, centralized. The top leadership would plan something and the lower levels, the movement would carry it out. At least that was the theory. Never quite worked out according to plan, but that was meant to be the hierarchy and the discipline of the movement. And in a way, it was easier to carry that over into purely electoral politics rather than that kind of chaotic, spontaneous protest politics, because you can plan election campaigns. You can say, right, we've got the 83 election coming up, and after that we've got the 84 election, then we've got the local elections, and we can send people out into action. And some of the habits that you would have built up as a military organization translate quite easily into electoral politics, that kind of discipline and dedication and so on. And you still see it to this day with the vote management techniques that Sinn Féin bring to bear, where they can have 5 seats out of 5 in West Belfast, or at least it was 5 seats out of 5 for Jerry Carroll, took one off them. But they do have that kind of ruthless organizational skills, but they never quite got back to, or even tried to get back to that politics of civil resistance. And it was something that was, some people I think had in mind when the IRA decided to end its campaign in the early 90s, and things were a lot more fluid then. I think that might seem in hindsight that there's often a kind of tendency to telescope the IRA and its campaign and the movement as a whole going into the peace process and agreeing to the Good Friday Agreement and agreeing to work within that framework. Whereas there would have been a lot of people at that time in the 80s, the early 90s, who agreed that the IRA campaign had to end sooner or later, that it was a dead end, that they couldn't win, that it was effectively a monkey on the back of the movement, and it was a barrier to any kind of progress. But they weren't necessarily committed to the alternative strategy that Gerry Adams had in mind, which was to reach out to the SDLP and to Fianna Fáil in the South and to people in the Clinton administration, and try to develop a kind of pan-nationalist alliance that would have, in itself would have much greater bargaining power than Sinn Féin on its own. But that kind of bargaining power could only be deployed on the basis of, a political agenda that the SDLP and Fianna Fáil and the Clinton administration were willing to support. So it obviously wasn't going to be as radical as anything Sinn Féin themselves had in mind. There's an interesting speech that I quoted in the book, which is, tied in with this idea of commemoration and people looking back, that in the summer of 1989, there was a meeting in West Belfast to talk about, the legacy of the civil rights movement, and it was chaired by Gerry Adams, and Bernadette McCaskey spoke on the platform along with Jim Givney, who, Jim Givney was someone who was always known as the person in the Sinn Féin leadership and in the Adams kitchen cabinet who was most sympathetic to the radical left and most influenced by them, and would selectively borrow ideas from them and bring them into the thinking of the provisionals. And later on, he became known as the kind of John the Baptist figure for Gerry Adams, where, anytime there was a controversial initiative they wanted to take, rather than Adams saying it himself, Jim Givney would be the one who go out there and make the speech and see how much of a backlash there was from people in the movement. And then later on, Gerry Adams could come on through and say, well, Jim makes some interesting points and we can take something on board from this. It was very, carefully choreographed. And as you know, to this day, if you want to know what the thinking of the movement is, you can do a lot worse than just read Jim Givney's column in the Irish News. But the speech that Jim Givney gave, it was interesting because it points in two directions. On the one hand, it seems to be pointing towards their strategy in the 90s, where he says, quite frankly, we have to accept that the movement is very isolated and that the philosophy that's built up through the struggle over the last 20 years, it doesn't have the capacity to motivate people anymore. And if we don't do something that will get us out of this impasse, then, as he put it, you actually run the risk of being defeated. And he was clear what he meant by that it wasn't just a question of not achieving our full goals, it was actually being defeated and not having anything to show for the struggle. So in that sense, it seems to be pointing towards the peace strategy of the Adams leadership. But the other part of it is interesting because, he talks about what is the alternative philosophy that we can put in place of what we have now. What is this liberating philosophy? And his answer was creative Marxism, which is not something that was, particularly in vogue at that moment. It was just a few months before the fall of the Berlin Wall, and Marxism of any kind was deeply unfashionable. And obviously it's not the path that Sinn Féin went on in the 90s. You didn't get Adams or Martin McGuinness going around saying that our alternative to armed struggle is creative Marxism. But it does show you that things were in flux at that moment. There was a sense of people, both in the leadership of the movement and in the kind of wider Republican constituency, they were trying out different things and looking at different routes. And it wasn't necessarily preordained that they would go down the road that they did go down, leading up to 98 and after.
Just to sum up, we're about to enter the 100th anniversary of partition itself, and the vastly opposing kind of positions that different political actors, academics and grassroots campaigns might have on that. And I'm just wondering, is there room for a Marxist alternative to the Northern Irish state?
Well, I hope so. Yeah, I mean, the story of Marxism in Ireland, it's an interesting, because Ireland is one of the countries where, um, Marx and Engels and later on Lenin and the Bolsheviks actually had a lot to say. Famously, um, Marx and Engels had a very strong interest in Irish politics in the 19th century, and Engels had personal ties to Ireland, and I believe he even taught himself Irish, because he wrote an unpublished history of Ireland. And then Lenin had a personal contact. There's the story, which may be an urban myth or not, that he spoke English with a posh Dublin accent because he had an English tutor for math minds. And he definitely did have a strong interest in what was happening at the time. And his most famous writings about the question of national self-determination explicitly refer to Ireland as, a touchstone. In effect, he said that any idea you had about nationalism and national identity and national self-determination, it had to fit the Irish case, or it wasn't very useful. But as you can see from the fact that different strands of Irish Marxism have taken such radically different positions on partition, where you've got everything from groups that had a kind of orange Marxism, as it was known, where they were strongly in support of the unionist position. A group like BICO, the British and Irish Communist Organisation, which was a huge influence on David Trimble, actually. It's just ironic, because you wouldn't think David Trimble was the sort of person who had been reading the output of a Maoist sect in the 1970s, but by all accounts, when he was a lecturer in Queen's, he get the pamphlets from BICO out from the university and read them avidly. He thought it was the best statement of the unionist case, better than any unionist apologists could manage themselves. And then he had all the way to the more kind of green, sympathetic, Republican, sympathetic Marxists. So going back to the classics, Marxism wasn't going to give you a clear answer. And Ireland, in a way, it's some of the fact that I think what Lenin said about national self-determination, it was absolutely right. And he was very clear-sighted in it, and more so than a lot of Marxists of his own time, and even subsequently. He recognized that national identity was something real, and you couldn't just wish it away and think, oh, well, if we talk about class politics and class identity and class consciousness, that'll overcome the national divide. And people won't think of themselves as Catholics or Protestants. They won't think of themselves as Serbs or Croats or Bosniaks, or Greeks or Turks. He said, no, this is something that's real. And speaking in the context of the Tsarist Empire, he said, we have to address all these national questions and conflicts in their own right, in the most democratic way possible, on the basis of self-determination for national communities. And we have to do that as well as having, a socialist system that hopefully will create the material preconditions for doing away with national antagonisms. But what that principle of self-determination doesn't tell you is, what do you do when you have a situation like in Ireland where people don't agree what the unit is in which you can have self-determination? And that's always been the essence of the dispute, where in the late 19th, early 20th century, Irish nationalists said, the whole island should be a single political unit as well as being a single geographical unit. Whereas unionists said, no, we don't accept that it's a single unit, and we don't think that the Protestant unionist population in the north should have their preferences overridden by the nationalist population across the whole island. And that's been the dispute. But even if you do accept that, the whole island isn't a single political unit in some kind of very simple, unproblematic way. Obviously, the way the partition was carried out was deeply undemocratic. Even if you believe that some form of partition was necessary and justified, it was clearly based on the idea that you would try and take over the largest possible territory that the Unionist Party at that time thought it could safely control. It wasn't based on any other principle than that. There were various ways that you could have done it, where if you had a plebiscite in every county, or if you went by parliamentary boundaries, or people have worked out various calculations for this, and it would have resulted in whole areas like Derry, the city, Fermanagh, the counties, parts of South Down and South Armagh, joining up with the South. And, it's an interesting counterfactual what would have happened if that was the case, because it was a consensus between both unionist and nationalist politicians that if the North had been any smaller than it was, it wouldn't have been a viable unit. That was the idea that Griffith and Collins had at the time of the treaty negotiations, that you'd have this boundary commission and it would self-evidently give over, a large chunk of territory to the south, and you would end up this kind of 4-county or 3.5-county unit, and that would be too small to be viable. And Carson and Craig from the other side of the fence also thought so, which is why they were so adamant on keeping hold of that territory. That's an open question, really, because the question of whether it would be viable or not, in a way, it all depends on what the British state was willing to accept, because it's never been viable in the sense of being a self-funding economic unit. Ever since the 20s, the Northern Ireland state relied upon subventions from the Treasury in London, and all the more so in the last few decades. But that's not, untypical. That it's not the only region within the UK where the local tax take isn't equivalent to the spending on public services, because some areas are more prosperous than others. So in a sense that any region within a state is viable as long as the state as a whole is willing to fund it. It's not that you're talking about Northern Ireland as an independent state, which has never, there was speculation on this in the 1970s, and some unionist politicians like William Craig were talking about the idea of having an independent Northern Ireland, but they never followed through on it, because you could see perfectly well there's no way it would be remotely viable. So it's an open question whether an alternative form of partition that was more in line with the wishes of people in those areas would have been viable or not. But one thing is absolutely clear, that once you did have that model of partition, the way Northern Ireland developed then over the next half century was almost preordained, because once you had that large nationalist minority, it was too small to actually be a real existential threat to the existence of the state, but it was just large enough that it could be presented as a threat. So it was just large enough that you could always keep that orange versus green polarization as the main axis of politics. And this isn't something that you're reading into people from the outside. It was quite openly stated by James Craig when he was abolishing PR for elections to Stormont in the late 1920s. And he said it was because he wanted every election in the North to be a straightforward referendum on the border, where you had the people who were for partition lined up here and the people who were against it lined up there, and the unionist side would always have a majority. And that would abort the development of class politics, which was obviously a concern for people like Carson and Craig as well. And so that was the situation right up until the late 1960s. So you do get an argument from more kind of liberal, reform-minded unionists, or people who are sympathetic to unionism, to say, yes, of course, sectarian discrimination against nationalists was wrong, and they shouldn't have been excluded from political power between the 1920s and the 1960s. And as a result of that, the civil rights movement did have some reasonable grievances that had to be addressed. But that doesn't mean that partition itself was wrong, or that the state itself was undemocratic. And I think that's too neat. I don't think you can just distinguish between the way the state was administered and the way the state was set up in the first place. The sectarian discrimination against nationalists and exclusion from political power and gerrymandering and all the other features of Stormont really flowed from the nature of the partition settlement back in 1920, 1921. So it is something that's it's going to have to be discussed in the context of the whether it's a celebration or a commemoration, or for some people it'll be a mourning of partition. But this idea that what happened in the early 1920s was simply a question of two national communities on the island, the Irish nationalist community, which made up the population of the south, and then the unionist Ulster Protestant community in the north. Whatever you think about how you define a nation, and this is something where, whether it's the Marxist tradition or other traditions, you have to recognize that there is no objective hard and fast scientific definition of what a nation is. You know, you could do a lot worse than the definition of a nation that Bloom has in Ulysses, that, you know, a nation is just a bunch of people living together in the same place, or a bunch of people living together in different places. You know, it really is just a question of what the consciousness that people have of themselves as a collective group of people is. And it's always shifting and it's always in motion. And so there's, you know, from a green nationalist perspective, there's really no point in wagging your fingers at unionists and saying to them, oh really guys, you are part of the Irish nation, and you just don't realize it, and you just need to come to terms with your true identity, which is something that you used to get from more simple-minded versions of nationalism, and even for the provisionals in their early history. They'd say, you know, unionists just need to get in touch with their Irish heritage and accept that they're Irish. And, you know, you can lecture people and wag your finger at them till you're blue in the face, but at the end of the day, what people think their identity is, that is what they are. You know, that's their consciousness. Whether they think of themselves as being Ulster, having an Ulster identity, or being British, or being Irish, or some kind of combination of the two, that's what they are. So that's not the way in which, you know, you would argue against partition. It's more a question of saying, whatever you think about the different communities on the island, the partition settlement clearly wasn't the best, or even the least worst way of addressing those questions. It was pretty close to being the worst of all the possible solutions that you could have imposed at that time.